some experiences I've had from traveling that you may be able to learn from so you don't end up in a position where your diabetes is dictating a good chunk of what goes on your next excursion. Security is very, 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 very hit and miss, and it depends the airport, depends on the person you get, depends where you are, etc. And with this, again, there's a lot of different options, a lot of different things. Some people say put your pump through the x-ray so nobody bugs you. Some people say don't put your pump through the x-ray and get your hands swabbed and the pump swab by TSA. There's a million different ways to do it, and there's no way that's theoretically wrong or right. It's just kind of do what you are comfortable with. What I would recommend is welcome to the Your Diabetes Insider podcast, where we take all of the mysteries of blood sugar control, focusing on nutrition, exercise, and any of the other 40 plus factors that may impact your blood sugar. If you don't know me, my name is Ben Zeal. I'm a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, strength and conditioning coach, and I've lived myself with type 1 diabetes for over 20 years, and I am here to share everything that I have learned in both my personal and professional experience so you can live that incredible diabetes life. So get ready and let's dive right into today's episode. What is going on? Welcome to this episode of the Your Diabetes Insider podcast. And we're in this time of year where you either just traveled or you're thinking about travel because the holidays will be here before you blink. And you're thinking about how the fall's going to go, how the next few months are going to go, maybe going to take a fun trip in the meantime. And I feel like it's really important to address diabetes and travel. And there's so many different things to talk about. I could probably make 7 different episodes just about this alone. But I wanted to cover some highlights, some important things, some experiences I've had from traveling that you may be able to learn from so you don't end up in a position where your diabetes is dictating a good chunk of what goes on your next excursion, whether it's for business, whether it's for pleasure, whether it's a combination, whether it's visiting family that you love or don't love, or whatever the situation may be. I want to make sure that it's a successful trip from a diabetes standpoint. And fortunately, in the past few months, I've came back from a honeymoon. We got married out of the country. We were already in a position to start our honeymoon, so I got a good glimpse at international travel. We also went to another wedding in the United Kingdom, which was a whole experience in and of itself. And I definitely want to shed a little bit of light based on that UK trip, especially because a couple things happened there that were not typical for me, but also may not typically come up in the life of someone living with diabetes. But you have to be aware and you have to be prepared for something like that to potentially happen. So let's start with a couple things out of the gate. So first things first, you're traveling, right? Let's just say you're going on an airplane, you're going for a few hours. Let's say you're in Florida and you're going to New York. Seems like a pretty popular flight path. So you have to go through TSA. You have to go through, your gate, you're sitting on the plane, you're at elevation, yada, yada. There's a million different factors, but let's break it down slowly, right? First things first, packing. Before we get anywhere else, you're not getting anywhere and you're not going to have a great time if you're not packed. So from a diabetes standpoint, my rule of thumb is always, and it will always be, 2 to 3 times the number of supplies that you think you need. So let's say you expect to do 1 site change while you're gone. It's a weekend trip, no big deal. I would bring at least 3 full set changes because you never, ever know what is going to happen while you're away. And prime example of this, the newest example of this that I have is that trip to the aforementioned UK trip. I was supposed to do 2, maybe 3 site changes depending on how things lined up. So I'm thinking, okay, 2 to 3 site changes. I should take 6, 7, 8 infusion sets just to make sure I'm okay. Because the last thing you need is, hey, I was running around and my cord got caught on a doorknob and it yanked out my site. And then the next site I put in had a problem. And you never know what's going to happen. And go through the trip, we're in the first couple of days, everything's great. And it's time to do that site change. So I go to put in the first site and I just knew immediately that the site was not good. And I yanked the site immediately. I have a pretty good sense for myself. It would have led to a lot of highs and a lot of annoyances. So next part of it, I go to put in the next site. This site still hurt, but something just felt off about that one as well. End up yanking the sight a few moments later. Lo and behold, what happens? But the sight was bent. So I trusted my instinct and I yanked the sight. Third sight, thankfully, was okay. But imagine I was only supposed to do 2, maybe 3 sight changes, and I only brought 3 infusion sets. Now I'm down to 0 infusion sets that are supposed to last me the rest of this trip. And this was the first sight change of the trip. So it's the first sight change of the trip. I'm now going to have to resort to injections when this infusion set has lived its entire life. That would not have been great. That would have definitely changed how things went. So 2 to 3 times the amount of supplies you think you're going to need. And then, of course, this is diabetes land. You're constantly thinking backup. You're thinking it's like sports, right? You're thinking next man up. You have a football game, the linebacker gets injured, they come out, the second string guy comes in. You know, the show must go on. You must continue to play. So in this case, same kind of thing. Okay, what do you have as your backup? The pump decides to bite the dust. You get a weird error and you're out of the country, you're out of your state and you don't know what to do. Well, you've got to have some sort of backup if you're on a pump. So that's when I would say, okay, you've got your long acting and your short acting pens. So that way you have a way of still simulating what you need. You've got your insulin. You're not having to inject every couple hours to maintain a quote basal rate, and you feel pretty good about things. And that would be that part, right? Then of course, paying attention to the pen needle tips. You've also got if you have a CGM, you've got your CGM measuring your blood sugar, but you got to make sure you've got the backup meter too, right? Because God forbid your Dexcom or your Libre or your, I guess Eversense isn't going to fall out, but you know, your Dexcom or your Libre comes off and now you have no way of knowing what your blood sugar is. And that's probably not going to end very well. So you've got to have the finger stick. And I would bring enough strips to make sure if you had to resort to testing more than 3, I was going to say more like 10, 11, 12 times a day, you are able to do that to maintain solid control. Because again, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to go on a trip, potentially a very highly anticipated trip, to then find out that on the first day or the second day, your entire trip is going to be completely wrecked by your blood sugar? Or would you rather say, hey, I brought a few extra things, it's all going to be good, and ultimately are able to enjoy the trip, even if diabetes tries to throw a wrench in your plans? You just threw a wrench right back at it. You're like, no, not today, fam, not today. I'm going to win. This is my life. This is what I do. This is my game, not yours. I personally prefer the second one, but that's just me. So making sure you've got the extra supplies is going to be absolutely paramount. But if we're then considering security, and there's this one, I have a lovely experience I'll share with you here, but security is very, 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 very hit and miss. And it depends the airport, depends on the person you get, depends where you are, etc. And with this, again, there's a lot of different options, a lot of different things. Some people say put your pump through the x-ray so nobody bugs you. Some people say don't put your pump through the x-ray and get your hands swabbed and the pump swabbed by TSA. There's a million different ways to do it, and there's no way that's theoretically wrong or right. It's just kind of do what you are comfortable with. What I would recommend is having a copy of your prescription and having potentially a note from your doctor, especially if it's international, to make sure that you are covered with respect to that. But if you've got your supplies, keep them on your person, keep them in your carry-on, or ideally in the bag under your seat, so that way you're never separated from them, because Lord forbid your bag gets lost. Or under the airplane, it's really hot and your insulin fries. That probably wouldn't be a great look either. So having your stuff with you and then going through security. With respect to that, you can choose to say, hey, this is my diabetes stuff. You can choose to leave it in your backpack and just send it through. I personally have just left my stuff through. Just put it through the x-ray and said, here you go. And it, knock on wood, right, seems to have worked so far. So I don't anticipate anything really changing there. But again, if someone were to ask anything, hey, this is my diabetes supplies, here's my prescription, here's my insulin, yada, yada, shouldn't be anything too crazy. And depending, I don't know about your experience, but depending on, again, if you have TSA pre-check, if you're in an airport that only has a metal detector versus has the whole scan thing where you stick your arms up and it goes past you. And usually on those, I will say, in those, my Dexcom always goes off and they have to, do the pat down. Oh, look, it's a Dexcom. Cool. Swab it. Done. If you do pre-check and you just go through a metal detector, usually nothing happens and everything's great. What I will say is went through good old London Heathrow on the way home. So it's been a solid trip. We're tired. We're ready to go home. Go to the airport, and this was a joyful experience. So I will preface by saying my blood sugar was 220. Well, 220, 225. I'd eaten breakfast. I did not really anticipate that the car ride to get to the airport was going to take over an hour. So my number was a little bit higher. I'd been more sedentary than I expected to be, underdosed a little bit, and you've got some nerves, right? It's an international flight. It's 9 hours, which I can't sleep on airplanes for the life of me. If someone knows how to do do that, please share your secrets, because I cannot get comfortable, even if it's an overnight flight. On the way to London on this trip, it was overnight. I think we left at 11 p.m. I could not sleep if you paid me. It was really painful, if I'm being honest. But that's besides the point here. So obviously I'm a little bit anxious. So my number's a little bit higher. So I go through security, and they're already a little bit different than we are here, right? In the US. They're asking to put all your liquids into stuff, and they're just very in depth with everything they're doing, which is fine. So I do my usual, right? I'm leaving I have the bag of the toiletries. I leave my diabetes stuff in my bag. It should be no big deal. I go to walk through. I'm fine. I go through one of the big scanny things, and the tube shaped thing. I'm totally fine. I go through, and then they pull my bag. And meanwhile, with this, just so you're aware, I had taken my pump off. I put it through. I kind of figured, hey, on the trips we had previously internationally, when we went on our honeymoon, we were in Athens. We flew out of Barcelona at one point. There were no issues when I did that. So I figured, hey, I'll put it through. No big deal. This airport, it was a big deal. They decided to say, okay, your bag, needs to get looked at. So I'm totally okay, except for the fact that I don't have my pump on. So I'm usually anticipating my pump will be on. My number's already a little bit high. The guy goes and brings my bag to the side or whatever. They go to check through my bag. And I ask, I'm like, hey, can I have my insulin pump? I really need it right now. And said it just like that. The guy flipped out on me. He says, I don't like how you're speaking to me, takes my bag, throws it behind him. Meanwhile, it's got all of my diabetes stuff in there. It's got all of my medications outside of diabetes, but it has my pump in there. It has my insulin in there. It's got everything in there. All of my infusion sets, my injections. So I've got nothing. I'm literally just standing there. And he's like, I don't like how you're talking to me. I'm going to wait till my manager can go through this, basically implying that I am being very belligerent and inappropriate, which I really don't appreciate, because all I asked for was my insulin, which, if you're listening to this, you probably know it is a life-saving medication. And I asked him, I need my insulin. I can't, this could be a very bad situation if I don't have it. And he gives no indication of anything, won't talk to me, shuts down completely. And this is supposed to be a very inclusive airport. There's signs all over. London Heathrow is a very inclusive airport, and even on the sign of the bathroom it says not all disabilities are visible. And then they act like this when I ask for my insulin pump. So a few minutes later, probably 5, 7, 8 minutes later, the manager comes by, and I explain. I literally lift up my shirt and show him my port for my site. And I said, I need my insulin pump, please. I do not have insulin attached to me right now. I don't care if you need to look through my bag, but I need my pump. And begrudgingly, he gives it back to me, then spends the next 10 minutes going through every single solitary item in my backpack. Shockingly, they found nothing exciting. So that was really a big surprise. It was literally just my diabetes stuff and then my other medication. And at the end, they say, hey, what airline are you flying? And so I said, it was Virgin Atlantic through Delta. So Virgin. And they said, okay. And then I went about my way, and I went to go board onto the flight. And I like to go, when I board, I like to, wipe the seat down and all that, because I don't know who's been there before. And planes are kind of as it is. And of course, I am, quote, randomly selected to then have all of my stuff gone through again. And it really left a bad taste in my mouth with respect to Heathrow. But the reason I'm telling you this story is not to scare you. It's not to say every airport's terrible or London Heathrow's terrible or this is the worst thing ever. It's to tell you that it's important, number one, to self-advocate. Because if you're not self-advocating, I don't even want to know what could have happened there. I could have had my bag gone for an hour for all I know. And with no insulin for an hour, that's asking for a high blood sugar, especially right before a 9-hour flight's not exactly going to be great. But second, just to make sure you've got your documentation with respect to your insulin, you've got your doctor's note, you're able to articulate what's going on, what your needs are, and then additionally to make sure that you're prepared. And maybe, in that case, in that airport, maybe you keep your pump on in that situation, but it's something to just be aware of. There's some agents that are like that, and there's some people that they could care less. On the way out of Tampa, they could not have cared less. It was just like any other flight. Bag goes through, everything's great, and we're in and out in 45 seconds. So it's all dependent, to a degree on luck of the draw. But at the same time, if you have your documentation for your medication, you have your prescriptions, you have everything else, you should be in a good spot. And that still does not change anything with respect to keeping your insulin and your supplies with you. If you don't, I swear you are asking for it, and it's not a good thing. You do not want any reason for your diabetes supplies to be separated from you, because God forbid they lose it or your insulin goes away or something happens, it's not great. So that would be something just to pay attention to with respect to TSA, and there's already stress with that. But then to continue on the flying thing, I could do a whole separate one on road trips or other kind of travel. I've never been on a boat for a long time, so that's, maybe that'll be a future one, but can do a different one on road trips in the future if you want. Just holler at me, let me know. But with respect to the next part of flying, right? You're going to be seated for a pretty extensive period of time. More than likely, unless you're taking a really quick flight, for example, Atlanta to Charlotte. At that point, I would probably just drive it, but that's just me, right? You're on a really quick flight or you have a connecting flight or something, you're probably going to be seated for at least an hour and a half, 2 hours. And if that is the case, you are going to probably get more insulin resistant. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, think about it, right? You aren't moving. Your body is not doing anything. You are seated on a plane. Maybe you're playing the games that they have on the screen on the back of the seat. Maybe you're watching a movie. Maybe you're, I don't know, you could be reading a magazine or a book or something, playing on an iPad. I don't know. But you're just seated there. There's not a whole lot of space to maneuver or do anything exciting. Even on an international flight, there's really not a whole lot of room to pace or anything like that. So because you're going to be seated for an extensive period of time, your body is going to get more resistant. And then tack on the fact that you are now going to 35,000, 40,000 feet in the sky. So you are going to be at altitude, which is a stress on your body. Stress on your body means more cortisol. More cortisol means that you are likely going to have more insulin resistance and potentially a little bit of extra glucose getting dumped into the bloodstream, aka blood sugar going up. Then throw in the fact that you're sedentary, not going to help your case. Then throw in the fact that altitude means you're going to get more dehydrated. And when you're dehydrated, that can also lead to insulin resistance. So if your number is already high, it's going to be harder to potentially bring it down. So you start to see this entire loop that just kind of perpetuates itself. You're dehydrated, you're at elevation, you're not moving a whole lot. You try to lower your blood sugar, it's not working as well. So before you get on a flight, if you have the possibility of doing so, I would highly recommend some sort of workout. And I'm not saying you need to go do your craziest, most insane 2-hour crazy workout of the week. You can, but you just got to do something to boost that insulin sensitivity. Because remember, when you're exercising, you go to the gym or you go to do a Peloton class or you go do a workout off of YouTube or you go for a run outside, you are boosting your insulin sensitivity for at least 24 hours. Potentially the effects are even longer than that. So by doing something ahead of your flight, even just a few hours ahead of time, you are setting yourself up to be in a good situation. So your insulin sensitivity is higher. So ideally the flight doesn't impact your blood sugars by as much. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend doing something like that. And in the event you don't necessarily have time or you're working and going straight to the airport or whatever it might be, you probably have some time before the flight boards to get some walking in around the terminal. And you might think that people think you're crazy and they're seeing you walk around in circles and that you're weird, and who cares what they think? I sure as heck don't care what they think. I film videos in the middle of the airport sometimes. I was doing curls with my bags, which I thought was hilarious. Amelia was losing her mind in the middle of the area that people sit for a flight. And people kept staring at me like, who is this dude? And why is he doing curls with his bag? And no, I wasn't actually working out, but A, it was hilarious to watch their responses. But B, it's people, it doesn't matter what people think. Who cares what people think? So get that movement in prior. It's going to do a ton of good for you. And then consider too, the snacks that they tend to serve. Again, you can obviously get water. They have soda and all that stuff. But when they tend to give out snacks, the snacks tend to be blood sugar bombs. The next time you go on a flight, I want you to pay attention. I want you to see what snack offerings that these airlines have, because I'm not going to lie, they're almost comical from a dietitian perspective. Like I have to say, I understand why they got rid of the peanuts. Like I remember on Southwest, it used to be, you get a bag of peanuts and it was like, 80 calories and basically no carbs. And I loved it. It was perfect for the blood sugars. It tasted good. Now there's all the allergies. They don't want to do that. And I totally understand. But what I will say is the snacks they've replaced them with, man, sometimes you're not only picking the best of the worst, it's like which one is the least bad. And I don't want to classify food as good and bad. I'm talking about it from a blood sugar perspective, because you'll look at these things and sometimes you'll have popcorners, you'll have a granola bar, and if you're lucky, you'll have almonds, but that's pushing it. That's like every now and then. It's kind of like a lunar eclipse. It tends to be something popcorner like, so some sort of chip that's rice based that's going to make your blood sugar go boom, that has no fiber in it. Some sort of bar of sorts that's usually a granola bar type that's got all sorts of Lord knows what kind of different sugar syrups in there to make it taste great. And then typically your third option, you like to try to find it to be a lower carb thing. It doesn't tend to be, but they'll call it, like healthy, and it'll be a fruit squeeze square or something, which is really just an overly processed piece of fruit that's in a bar form type of thing. And again, I'm not saying every airline's like this. I have not flown every airline. Some places charge you for the snacks, depending if you go on one of those Frontier or Allegiant type of airlines, and it's all relative, but the snacks that they serve you are not going to do anything great for your blood sugar. So my recommendation there would be if you are in the States, you can, I mean, even in the UK, we brought food through. We went to the Borough Market, I believe it's called, and there was some good looking food there. And we were thinking, I want some of this and I don't want to eat it right this minute. So we brought it through and they let that through, not the diabetes supplies, but they let that through, right? So with respect to that, you can bring food through security. So bring it, take advantage of that. Bring something that's going to be good for your blood sugar. Now, food safety wise, of course, right? I'm not advocating to go bring some sort of egg salad sandwich and let it sit for 2.5 hours. It's not a great life decision. But at the same time, if you can bring something through, for example, you bring some turkey sticks, or you bring, one of my favorite things I really love are wisps. They're like these like cheese little circle things, and they're basically no carbs, but they're a decent source of protein. They taste amazing. Got this lower carb granola that I really like lately, all sorts of stuff. And just bring that through. And then when you want to have it, eat it, or have a protein bar. That's what I'll also put in my bag just in case I do need something, or in case, you go on an international flight and the food is abysmal, at least I've got a protein bar. So really make sure that you've got something with you that you can eat besides your low snacks. The low snacks go without saying, right? The last thing you want is, hey, I'm sitting here and we're in takeoff and now I'm low and I have nothing and I'm waiting on the juice from the flight attendant and I don't know when they're going to start the in-flight service, and oh my God, there's turbulence and now no one can stand up and the flight's really short, so they're not going to do service, and you get the idea. I will say, lows, I don't want to say lows are likely or not likely, but one thing I do want to cover a little bit is something, I had a patient bring this up the other day. They were going to fly and they were concerned. They were on a pump and they've seen a bunch of people posting where they'll say, holy cow, went on an airplane and as the elevation changed and the flight took off, there was a lot of pressure and it forced insulin into my tubing, into my pump, and it gave me a dose. And then they got concerned because they're like, how much did I get? I don't know how much I got. Or what if my number goes lower? What if it gives me 10 units? And I'm sure at some point in some capacity, there was a singular person or a couple people that had something like that happen to them where it was substantial and they had a low blood sugar. I'm not going to deny that for a second. That stuff happens periodically. It's weird. It's not typical, but it does every now and then happen. But what I want you to think about when it comes to flying, and if you have concerns about this particular, this particular thing, this particular topic of, oh my goodness, is my pump going to dose itself because of the pressure change? First of all, pretty sure the pump companies have heard about this and are on top of it. But the second thing is, I remember my parents taught me a quote when I was a kid, and it was, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And what I mean by that is, don't always think the weird thing is necessarily going to happen. So sure, could it happen? Absolutely. You know what else could happen? I could go walk outside and get hit by a meteor. I mean, that would not be fun. I wouldn't be happy if I was hit by a meteor, but it could happen. There was a guy in the Guinness Book of World Records who got struck by lightning multiple times in his life. The same guy. And he had no reason to be. He just was struck by lightning multiple times. I want to say it was well over 3 or 4 times. Like, I think he was struck like 7 or 8 times. But regardless, the point I'm trying to make is those little one-off, 1 in 100,000 type of things, don't be super concerned about those. Be ready in case something happens. Have those low snacks, but trust your preparation. You know what to do. And then do your thing. Live your life. It's going to be fine. Every now and then I'll go low on a flight. The flight to the UK, I did end up going low, but it wasn't because of the insulin getting forced out through the tubing from the pressure change. It was because I literally dosed too much for something I ate because I had just walked around the airport a ton, didn't think it was going to impact me as much. And I was like, oh, I'll dose. And then kaboom. And I hit like 65. It happens. It is what it is. But that's something I don't want you to necessarily be super, 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 super concerned about. But make sure you've got your low snacks. You've got your other food. And then if you're on an international flight, and this one was interesting to me. I'm sure at some point in your life, you've heard the term diabetic meal. And to me, those words are like nails on a chalkboard, especially going back to my dietitian training days where I was working in the hospital and there would be patients, they would have diabetes type 1 or type 2, and they would be given the diabetic meal plan. And holy smokes, it was horrible. It was terrible. 0 out of 10 recommend. -10 out of 10 recommend. It was that bad. What would it be? It would be this bland, nasty food that was just straight carbs that were easy to count. And I say easy to count with air quotes because sure, they were in multiples of 15 because someone in 1986 decided that 15 was a great number for diabetes and for carbs and for exchanges. And these people would get 4 or 5 exchanges per meal. And it was dreadful, even though the reality is, and we know as people with diabetes, we can theoretically eat whatever we want as long as we are smart about it and count it appropriately. So I say all of this to say you have the option on international flight. Prior to leaving, I think it's 48 hours earlier, I asked the flight attendant on the way to our honeymoon about this because I hadn't flown internationally in like 4 years. But she said, yeah, 48 hours before, you're able to request a meal if you need a specific type of meal, and you can request a diabetic meal. But then I got to thinking, and I'm like, I don't want a diabetic meal. That sounds terrible. And I did some searching on it, and the people who would talk about their diabetic meals, it was terrible. They would get lifeless, nasty, bland, unseasoned chicken. They'd get unseasoned everything because there's supposed to be no sodium, which that part I can kind of get. All the airplane food is super salty, but there'd be no seasoning, no taste, no sodium, rubbery chicken, nasty veggies, mashed potatoes. There was nothing that indicated that it was actually blood sugar friendly. It was just, we measured all this stuff specifically so you know the carb count, which you could figure out anyway, and half the airlines have the nutrition info on the container anyway. I know Virgin Atlantic just did. So it just seemed very strange to me. And the descriptions of this food that people were putting in these forms were terrible. They were like, it's disgusting. I would have rather just eaten the regular meal. So after seeing that on the way back from our honeymoon, I was thinking, I'm not going to bother with that. So my recommendation to you on these flights, and I've been fortunate so far, and I guess at this point it would be 3 times. Yeah. So it'd be the 3 times that I've flown since then. When you get on the plane, really politely go up to the flight attendant and say, hey, I live with type 1 diabetes, or I live with type 2 diabetes, if that's you. In my case, hey, I live with type 1 diabetes. I know that there are specific meals and specific options that exist on this flight. Do you know what they are? Because I need to find one that's really friendly for my blood sugar. And they'll usually tell you it's typically there's a meat-based option and a vegetarian-based option. If you're vegetarian, do your thing, get the vegetarian one. But if you can have the meat, I would recommend trying to get that, because at least there's going to be some semblance of protein, not much, but there's going to be something versus just a complete carb bomb. And then on the flip side, you'll ask, hey, can I please have the chicken one if possible? I know I'm sitting in this seat. They'll usually write down your seat number and make sure you get your meal. And this is really important because, again, you don't want to be reliant necessarily on their food. You ideally can bring something in, but if it's a 9-hour flight, you can't have food just sitting there for 9 hours. It's not going to stay good. If you're lucky and you get food maybe, 20 minutes before you go to board, that food might be good for another hour and a half. And so what you don't want is to end up in a food safety situation because you're trying to prep, but it doesn't work. But you also don't want to end up in a situation where you end up with a meal that is not going to be conducive to your blood sugars. And a prime example, you'll love this. This is the first time I ever flew on an international flight. So I was nervous out of my mind. This was years ago. This was 2019. So we were flying and it was on United/Lufthansa. I believe I said that correctly. And I didn't know any of this stuff. This was way early on in my career. And I knew nothing about international flights. I'd never been on one before. So they come to serve us and I hear there's a chicken option and there's, I think, a lasagna. I said, hey, can I have the chicken? And the flight attendant told me, no, we don't have any more chicken. And at that time, I was so nervous, my blood sugar was 248. And I will say, the 2 examples I've given, my numbers were a little bit higher. I'm typically well more controlled, but that was my first ever international flight. So I was very nervous. I'd been nervous for a couple days before. And I told the guy, I'm like, I can't have this lasagna. Like, my blood sugar's high. I need something that's conducive for my blood sugar. And this is not something that I can use. And so what does he say in his infinite wisdom to a dietitian and future diabetes educator who has lived with diabetes at that point for over 20 years? He says, well, the chicken was covered in cheese and cheese is carbs, so you couldn't have it anyway. Cheese is carbs. Can you let that one sink in for a second? Oh man. I don't want to say I went, hammer time on him, but man, let's just say I gave him some nice mouthfuls and he said, you know what, I'll see what I can do. And an hour later emerged from first class with the meal there. So again, don't expect that every time. They ended up having salmon. It was actually not terrible. Instead, just advocate for yourself and go on the plane and say, hey, what are the options? Hey, can I have this one, please? It'll be better for my blood sugar and I'll feel a lot better. They tend to be pretty nice, especially if you approach them from a place of love and kindness and gratitude, as opposed to a place of, hey, I need this stuff and I need it now, damn it, because no, they're not going to like you if you do that. If you Karen them, or male Karen, whatever the name is for that, it's not going to go well. But if you come at them from a place of gratitude and, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you might be able to do this. This is the situation. They'll usually help you out. And also, I would say, on those flights, long flight, short flight, hydrate like crazy. You're going to get more dehydrated, and Lord forbid your number goes up. It's going to be a lot harder to bring it down. So on this most recent flight, they had these giant 1.5 liter water bottles, and I had one of those shaker bottles, like the ones you can put protein powder in, or you can just drink one of these. And subsequently, I just had them fill up the water bottle for me, so that way I didn't have to worry about getting a little cup and having them fill it up all the time. They just kept filling up my water bottle, which if you're not bringing one of those on a flight, pro tip, bring an empty one, fill it after you go through security. It's going to be a dollar saver, but also life-changing for you, because you will always stay hydrated that way. So those would be my biggest things in terms of the flying situation. Oh, one other thing, just thought of it. If you're changing time zones, you have two choices. You can change your time zone when you land. You can change your time zone when you first get on the plane, but pick one and stick with it. I personally change the time zone when I land, because at that point, my body clock's been operating at a certain time through the whole day. So what I don't want is, oh, cool, I'm flying to Los Angeles. It's 11 a.m. Tampa time. Oh, I got to LA. It's 5 p.m. local time. Well, I don't know if these numbers are right. I'm just making it up. Oh, but it's really 8 body clock. So that's going to mess with things while I'm flying. So I would rather just keep it the same until I get to where I'm going to go and then change it. But again, pick one, stick with it. You should be fine. This is just a pretty good overview for flying with diabetes. Travel's a really big deal. I know a lot of people love it. I love it. It's something you get to see amazing different cultures, different types of food, experiences, all of that. And so you don't want your diabetes messing with it. And the flight process can be stressful as it is. And you can have great experiences. You can have awful experiences. Typically it's something in between, and typically leaning towards great, but you got to be prepared for anything that could be thrown in your path. So let me know, what was your biggest takeaway from this? Let me know what travel questions you still have. If it's something that's on your brain you're struggling with, if you want me to do one on road trips, if you want me to continue doing one on flying and what's going on with that, let me know. Let me know what other topics are on your brain that you'd love for me to cover in a future episode. And if you need extra support, happy to help provide that. Holler at me over on the gram, or just send your question 813-649-3081. We're here for you. We got your back. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next episode. God bless.